So this week's Parsha is just Metzora this year because of the leap month of Adar. We don't have to double up on Parshiot. But the topic of the Metzora, of someone afflicted either with bodily or other kinds of what is translated as leprosy, spans this week's Parsha and last week's Parsha. So I hope everyone will be okay with the fact that one of the sources comes from Tazria and one comes from Metzora, but still definitely applicable in this week's Parsha. And as Michael so beautifully alluded to last week in Shul, we don't really know what Sarat is. It's translated as leprosy, but it is definitely not what we call leprosy today as like sort of a medical term. The JTS translation calls it a scaly affliction. So it's like pretty unclear what it is, but the rabbis have a lot of ideas about how and why we get it. So I did not bring the source. So before I share the source sheet, the Gemara in Archin says that there are 7 reasons you can get Sarat. And they are gossip, bloodshed, perjury, incest, pride, robbery, and selfishness, which is a long and very comprehensive list. And I want to look at 2 examples, one that comes from like sort of that gossip category and one that comes from the selfishness category, to think about why people get Sarat and what we can do to maybe combat Sarat is the right word for it. And how it could remain relevant today, even when we do not, oops, that is not right, hold on. Even though that's not we don't, thank God, we are not afflicted any longer with Sarat. Okay, let's try this again. Okay. So the first case that I want to look at, again, is from last week's, the tail end of last week's Parsha Tazria. And this is a case of bodily Sarat, right? So we can see here in the text that when someone has this Be'or Bisaro, the sort of weird swelling or discoloration of the flesh, and it develops into this negat zarat, which you can see here. Oops, I'm about to mess up the whole source sheet. The negat zarat, which is the affliction of leprosy or the scaly affliction, he has to go to the Kohen. And if diagnosed by the Kohen, he has to leave, the person with Sarat has to leave the camp. And right, we see here at the end, v'hisgir hakohen et hanega shivat yamim, and that the Kohen isolates the person. Hello, Mark. The person is isolated by the Kohen for 7 days. And kol yemei asher hanega bo, as long as he has the tzarat on him, yitamei tamehu, then he is considered unclean. Badad yeshev michutz l'machane moshavo, and he sits far outside of the camp. So that's case number 1, is the person gets tzarat on their body, and they have to leave the camp as a result. And then let's like hold on to that and look at case number 2, and then we'll sort of compare back and forth between them. In case number 2, which is at the very beginning of this week's Parsha, is a case of like what we might call house tzarat, item tzarat, as opposed to body tzarat. And so here, talking about when we come into the land of Canaan, lots of interesting interpretations as to like why this happens maybe only in Israel. It's God says, "V'natati nega tzarat bebeit eret achuzatchem," that I will inflict this eruptive plague of tzarat upon the house that you possess. And if this happens, unfortunately to you, right, you go to the Kohen, sort of similar to the bodily tzarat, and you have to tell him, right, like, Kenega nir ali babayit, it looks to me like I have a tzarat of the house. And what the priest does, what the Kohen does there is, v'tziva haKohen v'finu et habayit, v'terem yavo haKohen lirot et hanega v'lo yitzma kol asher babayit. Right, so the priest orders the house cleared. Everyone has got to go out of their house. And then he examines the affliction, and then, so that nothing will appear unclean. And after that, so in case number one, you have a person who has affliction, who has sarat on their body, and they have to go away from the camp, totally alone, right? They yashev badad, which is, today means like a similarly isolating experience in Israel. And in case number two, when sarat hits your house, you can't stay. You have to go be in the community. You have to leave your house and go into the community. So Devarim Rabbah, which again is not commenting here on our parsha, but is talking about the case of Miriam, I think sheds some light here. So just to remind people, since it's been more than a year since we've read the segment about Miriam, and I would say Miriam is sort of like the poster child for bodily tzarat. She gossips about Moshe to Aaron. And in Bamidbar, it says V'tidaber Miriam v'Aaron b'Moshe, right? That they spoke about Moshe, and we don't know what they said. And one of the things that strikes me about the tzarat that afflicts your body, which perhaps, as the Gemara in Archim says, right, is about gossip, is that gossip is hard to read, even when the person is talking, right? Sometimes, like maybe Miriam was joking, and Aaron sort of misunderstood her, or maybe she was being serious, but the power of our words is very strong. Last Shabbat is celebrated in many places as the Shabbat that where we make people aware of infertility issues. And I think that gossip is certainly connected in that way, right? Even well-meaning, what are you waiting for? You'd make such beautiful children, right? Things that we say that seem fine are actually really intrusive, and they violate people's boundaries in really strong ways. Because it's unclear. And so we don't know what Miriam said about Moshe. Maybe she said, wow, Moshe really, I don't know, is looks so beautiful with his wife standing side by side, right? Something about Zipporah is what the Midrash says. And she might have meant it nicely, but again, it's sort of it violated the boundary of their private relationship. And so Hashem calls Miriam and Aaron forward to rebuke them. God afflicts Miriam with tzarat, and the thing that Hashem tells Moshe is that tells Miriam is that Moshe has a special relationship with God that Miriam and Aaron couldn't possibly have understood. And I think that here, right, the lesson is sometimes when we engage in Lashon Hara, when we talk about people, we sort of assume that we know things that are true about them that are not true. Our boundaries become too permeable, right? We don't know why people choose not to have children, or why they choose to go shopping in the store or eat at that restaurant, or whatever the thing is. And so I think that the story here is that when you create your boundaries in such weak ways, you end up having to go create stronger boundaries far away, right? You have diminished the boundaries within your community, and so you have to leave. You have to set up a really firm boundary. No one is allowed to come near you for 7 days. And I think that's that time. Often in our house, we talk about consequences versus punishments, right? So instead of thinking about the badad as a punishment, I think it's interesting to think of it as a consequence. This person who clearly is having trouble understanding boundary lines needs to go and think a retreat, maybe a silent retreat, right? A meditative retreat to find better habits, to find ways to have healthy boundaries where we don't make assumptions about other people, and we don't talk about people in ways that sort of lends more familiarity than is maybe appropriate. The other case, the case of the house, right, I think is also sort of unclear as to how that relates here. And so here, this Devarim Rabbah, I think, is very useful. Right, in the second paragraph here, it says, "V'al yedei ma hanagaim ba'im." Why would someone deserve house tzarat? Right, what brings about house tzarat? And what the answer is al yedei ayin hara, which is commonly translated as an evil eye, but here I think it means a stingy eye. Right, so Rabbi Yitzchak explains, I'm a Rabbi Yitzchak, "B'nohag sheba'olam adam omer lechavero hashe'ileni kardumcha." Right? Someone comes, your neighbor, and says, can you please lend me your axe because I would like to chop this wood? And your neighbor is someone who never returns things on time, or who often returns things with like a new ding or a new scratch on it, right? And so you say, "Behu omer lo, ainli, oh, I don't have one anymore, sorry." May ayin hara, because of selfishness, right? And then another case with the sieve, out of selfishness. And so what is the, again, I wouldn't say a punishment, what is the consequence? Here, miyad ba hanega al beito techila. So immediately this nega, this sarat, afflicts his house. And then, as we saw in the pasuk, mifanin kol masha hayalo b'toch beito, right? They turn everything out of his house because they're emptying it for the kohen to be able to go in and check out like what kind of tzarat he has. And then everything is going to come out in the open. All of a sudden, the axe that you wouldn't lend your friend, or the baking supplies, or the safe air, or whatever it is sitting out on your front lawn. And your neighbor's like, "Oh, thought you didn't have that axe. Like, that's interesting," right? It exposes your selfishness to everyone. And it's kind of like a public shaming, perhaps, which is not really the type of way that I would want to go about remedying this. But I think that idea that like sometimes we set up boundaries that are too strong, that that cut off people from us and from our ability to be a part of the kohen of the community. And so here it's like the opposite of that meditative retreat, right? Here we're saying, look, you have to leave the safety, the seclusion, the isolation of your own home. You have to go stay with someone else. You have to show everyone what you had in your house, right? And I think there's something significant to the fact that you sort of lie about it. I don't have one, right? Maybe if you said, "Oh, my grandmother gave me this, I'm not sure I really want to lend it," right? That already creates a more permeable boundary where you're able to be honest and open and share with your community. But it's when you cut off all forms of communication, we have to think about going out into the community. And I think that here too, like there's a very real life component to this today. Like we all got very comfortable building up our very strong boundaries, or I will speak only for myself. I got very comfortable, right? Being only in my house, only with like a sort of approved set number of people that I saw, because that made me feel very safe during the pandemic. And a mask is like a boundary marker as well, right? Like everything sort of, I worked in the hospital as a chaplain for part of the pandemic, and I wore goggles and a face shield and a mask and gloves. And I said, like, how could I connect to anybody that way? I had so many boundaries sort of set up between myself and the patient. And I think that it makes us feel comfortable, right? It makes our boundaries thick, and that is helpful for us. And now that it's time to maybe say, we don't need so many boundaries, right? It's actually good to have people over. It's good to share your space and your like inner sanctuary with others. It's very hard to do. And so Tzaraat is like that sort of like peel the Band-Aid off all at one time solution, right? Like everything is going to be out in the open. All of your boundaries are going to be known to everybody. So I see them sort of as cases of like opposite directions, right? One person has no boundaries and they have to establish firmer boundaries by leaving the camp. One person, their boundaries are so impermeable that they're not able to share with their community. And so they're sent out to sort of erase their boundaries for that week when the Kohen looks in and their house gets healed. And it is, it's necessary for him to reevaluate, or her to reevaluate their boundaries. So I want to end with this one last source from Lachim Bet. It's a super interesting, lesser known Haftorah. I think that we will read it this week, because you read it when you only read Metzora. So if you read the double Parsha, you read Tazrias, but often we read Parshat HaChodesh, or we read Parshat like there are a lot of other special Parshiot and Haftorot that come in, but I should have checked beforehand. I'm 95% certain that we will read it this time. It's from Melachim Bet, from Perek Hay. And what we're going to look at Naaman, the Sartava Melech Aram, the commander of the king of Aram's army, because he has Tzaraat. So it's just a story. It's a great story, as many stories in Metzora are. So we see here that Naaman is described as someone, an ish gadol lifnei adonav. He's someone who is very important to his lord, the king of Aram. V'nusa panim kizo natan Hashem tshu'ah la'aram. V'ish haya gibor chayil Metzora. So he was high in his Lord's favor, and because Aram was doing well, although the Navi is clear to say this is not because necessarily of Naaman's prowess as a commander, but because of God granting victory to Aram. But the man, though a great warrior, right, even though he's a Gibor Chayil, he becomes a leper. And so Elisha, interestingly, sends a message to him. He tells Aram what to do to get rid of, Naaman to get rid of his tzara. So he says he sends a messenger, Vishlach elav Elisha Malach, Lemor, Haloch v'rachza sheva pa'amim b'Yarden, v'yisov b'sarcha lecha u'tahar. Right, he says, go and bathe 7 times in the Jordan River, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean. And here, I think that what is happening is Naaman is someone who has firm boundaries, right? He's above everyone. It's right, even the way that it's sort of reported, right? High in his favor, a great warrior. And what Elisha is telling him to do is to lower himself, to remove his boundaries, lower himself physically into the Yarden 7 times, and to be in this like very public space, doing this very public cure. And Naaman is very angry, right? He has come a great distance to talk to Elisha. And he says, he's very upset. He says, I thought that surely like there would be some grand thing, right? You would invoke the name of your God, you would wave your hands, and you would cure me. And here you're telling me to go into the Yarden, and not just any water, right? He goes on to say, Halo tov amana uparpar, which are naharot Damasek, right? Not the Amana and the Farfar, which are the rivers of Damascus, which are Mikol Mimei Yisrael, are better than all of the other waters of Israel. Erchat bahem v'taharti v'yafeh v'yelech b'chema. And he says, I should go there, right? I am someone who has boundaries. Not everyone doesn't. I'm not a lay person who just walks into the Yarden. I am fit for the waters of Amana and Farpar, not the Yarden. And he just sort of stalks off in a rage. And so he thinks that he is so far above everyone else, that his boundary is so impermeable, right? That he doesn't want to lower himself into the water, to demean himself in any way. And that maybe like he doesn't want to realize that no job or position in the community really like puts you above anyone else in the eyes of God. And so maybe the tzarat is there to help him remove those boundaries, to help him realize that he really is just like someone, he's still a human person, right? And so luckily for him, he has a very nice servant and a very brave servant, I would say, who comes forward, v'yigshu avadav v'yidabru elav, right? They come to him and they say, v'yamru avi davar gadol hanavi diber elecha, halo ta'aseh, v'af ki amar elecha rechatz utahar. He says, right, if the prophet told you to do something difficult, like to go acquire something very fancy that only generals could acquire, you totally would have done it because that felt like according to you. But so why wouldn't you do the simple, easy thing, right? He just tells you to go into the Yarden, which is like presumably very close by. And so he listens. Naaman, v'yired v'yitzbol b'Yarden sheva pa'amim ki devar ish ha'Elohim, right? Just like Elisha said, he did. V'yashav b'saro ki basar na'ar katon v'tahar. And his flesh becomes like a little boy's, like soft as a baby's bottom, right? And he was clean. And so it works, right? And I think it's interesting that Naaman needed Sarat to sort of realize that he could be like everyone else and also be a great general at the same time. And I think that is like what links him to the story, right? So his is bodily tzarat, not house tzarat, but it's the same kind of thing. Tzarat is, I think, perhaps a way of establishing boundaries in healthy ways. So for someone who has boundaries that are too strong, you have to work to remove them. And for someone who has boundaries that are too weak, you have to move to strengthen them. And maybe just to finish, and again, it's it's on the story sheet, but an interesting thing is that in these two parshiot, Tazria and Metzora, the word ro'eh appears dozens of times, because everything about the process of Tzarat is that it's necessary for the Kohen to come and see you. Inspecting the Tzarat, inspecting your house. And I heard a really interesting, I think it was a podcast, but it might have been like a Parsha sheet last year by Rabbi Avital Hachstein. She's a teacher on faculty at Machon Hadar in New York, the pluralistic or post-pluralistic yeshiva. And she thinks that this Parsha is really all about what it means to be seen and to see other people, right? So the Kohen sees and evaluates Tzarat. But maybe a part of that, right, is seeing our intentions and our understandings of the world, and trying to help us see how to get better, right? And so I think it relates to both cases. When you gossip about someone, you sort of you are making them seen in a way that they perhaps didn't want to be, right? Even if you're doing it again with good intention. Oh, maybe leave that person alone today at shul. She's upset because she just had a miscarriage. Again, like these are all, in my mind, I was thinking very much about infertility awareness Shabbat, but it could of course appear in lots of different ways. And it's making them seen in a way that perhaps they don't want to be seen, or maybe not seeing them enough. Oh, I saw someone at the vegan restaurant. I guess they don't really keep like real hashgacha anymore, right? And not understanding that they were out to dinner with a partner in their law firm or whatever the thing is, right? When we don't see someone enough. And then similarly, in the case of the house tzarat, like you are choosing not to see. You are locking yourself away in your space. You're not opening the door to someone who wants to borrow something. And you're not allowing yourself to be seen, knowing that we all have such beautiful things to show in this world. And so I guess maybe what I think about this and what I would think about today is that if we think about Tzarat as this affliction of poor boundaries or not seeing or being seen, like what might we make choices differently? I think when Tzarat feels mysterious, it's like hard to have any reaction today, and we don't get the sign of having our boundary too thick or too thin. But I think that what it's asking, I think the lesson of Tzarat is to ask us to act from empathy, to see, to have perspective, and to see and respect the boundaries of others and ourselves in ways that are healthy for everybody. Yeah. I welcome thoughts, questions. I talked a lot for 20 minutes. Okay, well, everyone should chew it over. And I hope that it brings some meaning to the strange rituals of Tzarat. I have to say that Ariella and David and Metzora have a horrible Parsha book. Parsha books for children are like the worst market for intellectual, liberal-minded thinkers, because there are none written by people like us. And it talked all about how your house gets Tzarat so that you can like uncover the jewels that were left behind in Israel by the people that we basically like expelled and murdered. And I thought like that can't be what Tzarat's about. And Ariella brought home that project that I also made when I was 7, with like the hand that has like the dots and then a finger over the lips, like say no lashon hara, And so I think it's a challenge to think about Tzarat in a way that's like healthy and value driven. But so this was my attempt this year. But hopefully it pushes us to think about the way we interact within our community in a different way. Okay, well, I hope to see everyone again in real life at 8 o'clock tonight at Mark and Jenny's home. There will be 6 different wines to taste from Plum Market. I went to Detroit for something else and I bought cheese guy cheese, so there'll be delicious cheese. Oh, thank you, Mark is reminding us his address, 1130 Fair Oaks Parkway. Bring yourself, bring a friend, bring a partner, bring everyone you know. And we hope to see you there. Have a good week, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.